The ship moved through the darkness the way old men moved through familiar rooms. Slow, certain, and never expecting anything to have changed. Ambassador Velarith stood at the forward observation deck, his hands folded behind his back, watching the dead star system grow across the glass. Sol, the humans had once called it, a yellow dwarf, unremarkable, the kind of star that gave birth to life the way stagnant water bred mosquitoes, carelessly, without intention, and often to everyone's regret. He had requested this assignment himself. That was the part none of his staff understood. Why would a man of his standing, a diplomat with 300 years of conclave service, negotiator of the Thurin Accords, the only living envoy to have spoken directly with a Chorus-adjacent entity and survived the conversation, ask to personally survey a confirmed dead world? Because Velarith had been on the council that voted for the quarantine 206 years ago. He had been young then, relatively speaking, a junior attaché. He had not cast the deciding vote. He had not drafted the order. But he had raised no objection when the measure passed. And in 3 centuries of diplomacy, he had learned one truth above all others. Silence in a room where decisions are made is its own kind of signature. He owed this world something, a final confirmation, a clean record. The third planet came into view. He looked at it the way one looks at an old scar, long forgotten, distant recognition, and nothing more. Sol 3, Earth, confirmed uninhabited. The report was 2 centuries old, but it had been re-verified by long-range scans 17 times since. Radiation levels matched sustained orbital strike patterns. Atmospheric particulates suggested ongoing geological instability caused by massive impact craters. Surface temperature fluctuations were extreme enough to preclude complex macro-level biology. Dead. Clearly. Definitively. Mercifully dead. Begin the standard survey sweep, Velarith said. His aide, a young hegemony-born woman named Sel, tapped the sequence into her panel. Sweep initiated, Ambassador. Estimated surface pattern completion in 40 minutes. He nodded. Draft the confirmation report ahead of the findings. Sel glanced at him. Before the sweep is complete, sir? He considered for a moment. Draft it. Leave the specifics blank. She nodded. This was normal. Most survey confirmations for dead worlds were drafted before the sweep even finished. The sweep was a formality. The findings were always the same as the previous scans. The ship hummed softly as the survey ran. Velarith walked to the small side table where his morning tea had gone cold and drank it anyway. He had spent 3 centuries drinking cold tea at moments exactly like this. There was something almost comforting about it. Then Sel's voice broke the silence. Not alarmed. Not yet. It was the tone of someone who had found something unexpected in a drawer they thought they knew well and had not yet decided whether it was interesting or dangerous. Ambassador, he turned. She was staring at her panel. The sweep is returning anomalous subsurface readings. Geological instability is expected. Not geological, sir. She looked up. Thermal. Structural. Organized thermal signatures approximately 240 meters below surface grade. She paused. Across 17 mapped locations simultaneously. Velarith slowly set down his tea. He crossed to her station and studied the data. Then he looked again. He pulled up the previous 17 scan reports and ran an immediate comparison. The answer came quickly. The earlier scans had never penetrated below the surface. They had only read the surface. And the surface was dead. No one had thought to look beneath it, because dead things do not dig. Adjust the sweep parameters, he said. His voice perfectly professional. It was very good at being professional. Full subsurface penetration. All depths. Sel obeyed. The sweep ran again. This time the data returned in layers. First 200 meters. Then 300. Then 400. The signatures expanded like a sentence that kept adding words long after you thought it had ended. Thermal clusters became power grids. Power grids became water systems. Water systems became transit lines. And then, at 600 meters depth, the ship's analysis system flagged something with a symbol Velarith had never seen before. He leaned closer. Population density exceeds scan parameter maximum. unable to complete count. He straightened slowly. Cell said nothing. She was wise enough to understand that silence was now the correct response. "Take us into orbit," he said. She hesitated. "Sir, take us into orbit." Same tone, different weight. She obeyed. The ship descended deeper into Sol system and settled into tight orbit around the third planet. Then the full picture assembled itself across every screen on the bridge at once, like a puzzle that had simply been waiting for someone to spill out the pieces. 17 surface locations. 11 additional locations the preliminary sweep had completely missed. Underground architecture spanning 6 of the planet's 8 continental landmasses. Power output readings that would have ranked the civilization as a mid-tier conclave member state, if those readings had been visible from outside. They had not been. They had been, it was now painfully obvious, deliberately shielded. 200 years, Velarith said quietly. No one answered. The bridge crew stared at their screens with the rigid stillness of people who understood that what they were witnessing existed far above their pay grade and far below their clearance level. He wasn't speaking to them anyway. He was speaking to the data. 200 years underground. 200 years of shielded output. Buried architecture. 0 surface signal. 17 consecutive long-range scans that had found absolutely nothing. That took precision. That took patience. That took the kind of organizational discipline most surviving civilizations could not maintain for a single generation, let alone 2 centuries. And it meant only one thing. Humanity had never died. They had gone to ground. The system had worked perfectly until 30 minutes ago. Then the ground opened. There was no other way to describe it. The scarred, irradiated, geologically battered surface of what was supposed to be a dead world split apart along lines that were obviously not natural. Not fractures. Not fault lines. Seams. Enormous seams running for kilometers in deliberate, perfectly straight lines. Patches. Because that was what they were. There was no point pretending otherwise now. They slid back with hydraulic precision. Measured, controlled, deliberate. Velarith counted 11 of them opening simultaneously. Then light rose from below. Not the yellow-orange glow of geothermal activity. White light. Blue-white. Artificial light. The kind of light produced by a civilization that had decided exactly what kind of illumination it wanted and had built machines to create precisely that. Then the heat signatures began to rise. People. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Emerging from below in organized formation. Not a scramble. Not a panicked crowd. Structured movement. Patterned. The kind of motion that spoke of drills, plans, and people who had been told exactly what to do when this moment came. And they had prepared for this moment. That much was clear. They had been waiting for exactly this. "Ambassador," Cell said. Her voice had moved beyond careful neutrality into something caught between awe and fear. "They're signaling us." "I know. In hegemony standard." He turned sharply. "Perfect hegemony standard? Or approximated?" She listened for another moment. "Perfect, sir. No accent. No errors. Current idiom." She paused. "Not the standard from 200 years ago. Current standard. The same dialect we're using right now." Velarith went still. He understood what that meant. A civilization buried underground for 2 centuries should not know the current language of the galaxy unless they had been listening all this time. Silently beneath the surface of a world the Conclave believed was a tomb. They had been monitoring communications, learning, adapting, and keeping pace. "They've been monitoring us," he said. "Yes, sir." "For how long?" Cell hesitated. "Based on the idiomatic accuracy." "All of it, sir. I think all of it. 200 years of listening. Not merely surviving. Listening. Recording. Learning. Keeping pace with a galaxy that had declared them extinct from inside the grave the galaxy had assigned them. Velarith had spent 3 centuries in rooms where civilizations negotiated the terms of their survival. He had seen desperate peoples, proud peoples, broken peoples, and peoples who had become something frightening when cornered. He had never seen anything like what was rising from the ground below him. "Request landing clearance," he said. Cell turned sharply. "Sir, we came to confirm their status." He looked at the light pouring upward from the opened world. We will confirm it properly. Ambassador, the security protocols for first contact. They already know our protocols, Cell. He reached for his cold tea, then set it back down untouched. Request landing clearance. They landed inside the mouth of the largest open hatch. The space was so vast that the diplomatic shuttle sat within it like a pebble in the doorway of a cathedral. When the doors opened, the air that entered smelled of recycled atmosphere and clean mineral filtration, the unmistakable scent of engineered life support systems. And beneath that, something organic. A faint green scent. Living things. Plants. They were growing things underground. Velarith descended the ramp in full diplomatic dress. Pale robes, the conclave's 12-ray seal fixed to his collar, the silver conductor staff in hand. A symbol as much as a tool. He had dressed carefully. He always dressed carefully. Authority, stability, continuity. That was what it projected. The humans waiting at the perimeter said nothing about it. There were perhaps 200 of them in the landing zone. No visible weapons. That was either an excellent sign or a very bad one. Velarith had enough experience to know it was almost certainly the latter. People who displayed no weapons in a moment like this were not unarmed. They were simply already prepared. The humans looked like the archival records. Bipedal. Bilateral symmetry. Skin tones ranging from deep brown to pale ivory. The unmistakable variation of a species shaped by a diverse planetary world over tens of thousands of years. They wore practical clothing, dark, layered, functional. And they stood in formations that were unmistakably military, dressed in civilian clothing only as a courtesy. Every eye in the hangar was on him. No one looked surprised. They had expected this, prepared for it, and chosen this moment. They had opened the hatches because they had decided they were ready, and not a second sooner. He walked forward. Cell and 2 security officers followed. His guards were calm professionals, but even they were clearly doing rapid threat assessment and finding the mathematics deeply uncomfortable. At the edge of the perimeter, a human stepped forward. Older, dark-skinned, close-cropped silver hair. A face marked by the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from discipline practiced over a lifetime. Something hung from a cord at her throat, an emblem he did not recognize. She offered no greeting. She simply waited for him to speak first. This too was deliberate. I am Ambassador Velarith of the Galactic Conclave Hegemony Diplomatic Service, he said in careful standard. I am here on a standard survey. He stopped. The word survey had become grotesque in this context. He was too skilled a diplomat to finish a sentence that had already failed. The woman watched him stop. She did not rescue him. She simply waited. He began again. I am here to confirm the status of the Sol system and its inhabitants. A pause. I was not expecting inhabitants. We know, she said. 2 words. Flawless standard. No warmth. No hostility. Only information. He searched for a response and found none. Then movement caught the edge of his vision. He looked down. A child. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, who had slipped through the adults with the boneless ease unique to children. She stood 3 meters from him, head tilted, studying him with focused curiosity. She looked at his robes, his staff, his seal, then his face. And in perfect hegemony standard, in a voice entirely matter-of-fact, she asked, Are you here to apologize? The hangar went silent. Velarith had spoken to chorus-adjacent entities and survived. He had sat across from warlords, tyrants, and dying kings. He had delivered the worst news diplomacy ever required. He had no answer for an 8-year-old child asking that question as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. He looked toward the silver-haired woman. She was watching him, expression unchanged. The child waited. He opened his mouth, closed it. 300 years of diplomatic training reached for graceful deferrals, elegant redirections, standard non-answers, and found nothing. Nothing that would not be an insult. At last he said carefully, That is something which would need to be discussed at a higher level. The girl considered him for a moment, then nodded, as though this was more or less what she had expected. She turned and disappeared back into the crowd. Every adult in the hangar had watched the exchange without expression. The woman finally spoke. "My name is Commander Yara Oe, Terran Continuance Authority." She said it like a sentence spoken 10,000 times in silence before finally being said aloud. "You'll want to see the city." She did not wait for agreement. She turned and walked. He followed. Because there was nothing else to do. Because the child's question was still lodged between his ribs. Because as the corridor opened, the full scale of what humanity had built beneath the surface of its supposed tomb began to reveal itself. Ceilings stretching into engineered horizons, the precise hum of systems beyond counting, parks. Actual parks. Lit so perfectly that the plants growing within them did not know they were underground. And in that moment Velarith understood something. They had not survived. Survival was what wounded animals did. They found a hole. They hid. They waited. This was not that. This was something that had decided a very long time ago exactly what it intended to become. He walked the first kilometer of the Undercity and counted 17 categories of infrastructure he did not recognize. Not primitive. Not improvised. Unknown technologies. Developed in isolation. Built inside a sealed world by a civilization with no allies, no trade, no one to ask for help. 200 years of solving problems alone. He thought about what that created. 2 centuries of silence, of grief, of fury. All of it turned inward. All of it transformed into something that had grown in the dark. The city seemed endless. Velarith had visited 41 inhabited worlds in his career. He was not easily impressed. But there was something in the precision of this place. No waste, no excess, everything built for a purpose. And yet beauty remained. Those underground parks. Those absurd, defiant, completely unnecessary parks. They had built beauty in the dark. After everything, that was not survival. That was a message. He was still trying to read it when Commander Oe paused before a large display. For 3 seconds he saw it. A fleet manifest. Ship classes. Numbers. Deployment status. Then the screen was shut down. 3 seconds. Enough. He said nothing. She said nothing. But for the first time in 300 years of diplomatic service, Velarith did not know the next move. He did not know what humanity wanted. He did not know what they had become in the dark. He only knew one thing. They were not what the Conclave believed. They had never been. And the Conclave had just stepped into the middle of a plan that had been running for 200 years. The delegation moved in a tight cluster, 7 of them, plus Ambassador Velarith. He walked nearest to Yara, 3 steps behind, carrying the careful, controlled posture of a man highly trained in not revealing what he was thinking. The others were less disciplined. She could hear them speaking in low voices behind her, their tones attempting calm and failing. Good. The first section of Undercity Accra was the transit hub. Magnetic rail lines ran across 4 levels, carrying people between residential sectors, work sectors, and the agricultural belt in the Eastern Deep. The trains were nearly silent. They had spent 40 years making them that way, because underground noise accumulates and settles into the body like weight carried in the shoulders and into sleep. The trains moved like dark water, fast, smooth, and almost soundless. Thousands of people filled the hub at this hour. Morning shift beginning, night shift ending. People carrying bags, children, and the small armor of routine that people everywhere build around themselves when they are simply trying to make it through the day. They looked at the delegation. The delegation looked back. No one spoke, but the silence itself said everything. The people of Undercity Accra had always known this day would come. Not the exact date, not the hour, but the shape of it, the outline. A day when the people from above finally came down, or the people from below finally went up, and the 2 realities that had run in parallel for 200 years finally occupied the same physical space. They had been told to remain calm. They were calm. But it was not peaceful calm. It was the kind held deliberately, the way one holds something heavy above their head while waiting for the right moment to set it down. Yara kept walking. She led them next through the fabrication district. Long halls lined with manufacturing systems hummed at frequencies felt more than heard. Machines building other machines. Component production. materials processing, assembly lines for technologies Velareth had already noticed and was clearly trying to catalog. He asked her politely what one particular array of machines produced. She answered. She watched him process the response. She watched him realize that what was being built was a major piece of advanced technology. Then he asked equally politely where the design schematics had originated. "We improved them," she said. "From what original design?" he asked. "Yours." She kept walking, did not turn back, did not explain. The answer remained hanging in the corridor behind them, plain and unavoidable. Everything the Conclave had deployed against Earth during the Contact War. Every weapon, every drive system, every defensive architecture, the surviving fragments, the shattered systems that had fallen broken onto a dying surface. Humanity had recovered them, carried them underground, dismantled them, understood them, and improved them for 200 years. They had begun with the wreckage of what had been done to them and built forward from there without ever stopping. The Conclave had given them the curriculum. Humanity had done the homework. She brought them to the agricultural belt at 400 meters depth because she wanted them to see it, and because she knew exactly what it would do to them. The scale was the first thing that hit them. The ceiling arched 40 meters overhead, above endless beds of crops stretching for kilometers beneath light arrays so precisely calibrated that the plants grew in perfect vertical lines, reaching toward illumination they could not distinguish from sunlight. Rice, wheat, vegetables. Enough to ensure that no one in Undercity Accra had known hunger in 200 years. Not once. The air smelled of growing things, green, water, and soil, for 100 meters beneath an irradiated surface, and it smelled like a field in summer. One of the younger members of the delegation, a technical attaché with wide eyes and not yet enough training to conceal his reactions, stopped walking entirely. He stood at the entrance to the agricultural sector with his mouth slightly open. Yara stopped and let him have the moment. She was generous with these moments. They cost her nothing and moved everything toward where she needed it to go. "How long?" the young attaché asked. "How long has this been here?" The first agricultural level was completed 83 years after the quarantine, she said. "Before that, we lived on processed rations." She paused. "After that, we did not." He looked at the crops, at the light, at the impossible, organized scale of a people who had decided that life in the dark would still be life. Not survival. Living. "This is," he began. "It's enough," she said, not unkindly. "Come." She had a plan for this tour. Not a script. She didn't need a script. But there was a sequence. A deliberate order. Each section arranged to strike against the previous one like carefully chosen notes in a composition. First scale, then technology, then agriculture, then the schools. The schools mattered most. She had always known she would end there. They passed through a residential sector on the way. Real streets, underground streets, the kind of detail only possible when people commit themselves to permanence. Storefronts, community spaces, art on the walls. That was the detail she always watched the delegation for, because that was usually the moment when understanding shifted. Not propaganda. Not desperate survival markings. Art for its own sake. Murals. Sculptures. Beauty without utility. In one corridor, a massive mosaic covered the entire ceiling of a 40-meter passage. It depicted the surface of Earth, the world above them they could no longer live on. Blue sky. Clouds, trees, a sun they could not see from here. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and it was the saddest thing Yara had ever looked at. She had seen it so many times that she had taught herself not to feel it. But she was feeling it now. She kept walking. The schools waited in the eastern residential sector, a cluster of connected buildings organized around a central commons, and she knew this was where the real message would finally land. The schools were built around a central open space that served as a gathering area and a place for children to run, because children still needed to run, even underground, even when running meant moving in circles beneath artificial light. The buildings were well made and spotless. Someone had planted flowers in boxes along the outer walls. Small, bright things that had no right being beautiful 400 meters below the surface, and yet they were beautiful anyway. Classes were in session. Through the windows, children sat at long tables working. Their voices drifted through the walls as a warm, living hum that never quite resolved into individual words, only the sound of many minds engaged at once. Velarith was watching the school buildings with an expression he was controlling very carefully. Yara had been watching him control his expressions for nearly 2 hours now. He was exceptionally good at it, but even mastery develops hairline fractures under enough pressure. "What do they learn?" he asked. "Everything," she said, and then looked directly at him. "Science, history, engineering, mathematics, medicine, languages." She paused. "Hegemony standard is mandatory from age 5, as is a working knowledge of conclave law and diplomatic protocol." She watched the meaning land. "We wanted to make sure that when this day came, our people could speak to you directly. No intermediaries, no translators, no room for anything to be lost." He was quiet for a moment. "You have been preparing for this specific day for 200 years. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly, not agreement but understanding. The nod of someone finally seeing the full shape of what had been in front of him the entire time. One of the other delegates, a heavy-set senior official from the Tur Collective, spoke with the well-meaning clumsiness of someone who believed they were being generous. "It is remarkable. Given the circumstances, we had assumed you would not persist." The odds were, Yara stopped walking. The delegation halted behind her. She turned. Not quickly, not sharply, just with the full, exact weight of her attention. She looked directly at the official and said 4 words. "We know what you assumed." Then she turned back around and kept walking. No one spoke for a long time after that. Good, she thought. Let it sit. People often mistook her stillness for anger held in check. It wasn't anger. Anger was something she had spent carefully over the years in the right places. What remained was colder, more useful, clarity. She knew exactly what the conclave had assumed. She knew because her grandmother had told her. Her grandmother had been on the surface, had seen the conclave ships in the sky on the day they left, had watched them disappear and understood, in that terrible way people understand things for which they have no framework and no language, that no one was coming back. For 11 years afterward, her grandmother had lived in the ruins, doing 2 things: finding surviving children and teaching them everything she knew. At the end of those 11 years, when radiation had done enough damage that the rest was only a matter of time, she had called Yara's mother to her side and said, "Remember what we are doing this for. Not revenge. Not victory. Only this, that no one ever gets to decide what we are again." Then she had pulled a tooth from her own mouth and handed it to her. "Keep this. Give it to your daughter. Let her decide what it means when she is old enough." Yara had decided at 17. She had worn it ever since. She touched it now through the fabric at her throat without thinking, the way people touch the things that have become part of them. She brought the delegation to the command level last. The command level was not dramatic. It was not meant to impress. It was a functional space filled with people doing their jobs with the quiet competence of long practice. Screens covered every wall, tracking systems, communication arrays, and the full operational picture of a civilization running smoothly in the dark. On one large display on the eastern wall, a fleet manifest was visible for what appeared to be a routine morning review. Clearly and accidentally visible. She watched Velarith see it, watched his eyes move across the data. She counted 3 seconds. She had practiced this. Then she reached out and closed the display. "Apologies," she said. "That should have been closed before your arrival." "Of course," he replied. Neither of them believed the other. Both of them knew it. Neither said so. In those 3 seconds he had seen enough. 216 ships of classifications the Conclave had no records for, drive signatures that his analysts would spend the next week failing to match, crew counts large enough to place Terran military deployment among the top-tier forces in the galaxy. Even before the Void Chorus had erased 4 of those powers from existence. She had let him see it for one reason only, so that when the real conversation began, there would be no misunderstanding about what they were negotiating with. She walked the delegation back to the landing bay. The tour had taken 3 hours and 40 minutes. She had planned for 4, 12% more efficient than projected. Her team would note that. She did not care. At the shuttle, Velarith stopped before boarding and turned to face her. He had the look of a man assembling words with extreme care, as though each one might break if handled incorrectly. "Commander OA," he said. "What is it that your people want?" She looked at him, 300 years old, and carrying the weight of everything he had failed to do 2 centuries ago in the set of his shoulders. She recognized that kind of burden. She carried a different one herself. But his guilt did not interest her. Guilt belonged to his own knights. What interested her was what came next. "What we want," she said, "is not something you can give us today." She looked past him at the shuttle, at the 12-ray conclave seal on its side. The same symbol that had once hung in the sky above her grandmother's head when the ships left. "But there are things you may eventually give us. We will discuss them when there is something worth discussing." He waited. He sensed there was more. There was, "You asked what we want. Here is what I will tell you for free, Ambassador. We do not want membership. We do not want partnership. We do not want to join the structure that left us here." She said it without heat, without performance. Clean information, exact from edge to edge. "We want recognition of what happened. Full, unambiguous, on the record. And we want the freedom to remain what we have become without anyone from above deciding what that is." She paused. "The rest is negotiable. But not those 2 things." He nodded, the nod of a man who had expected something like this and still found it difficult to hear once spoken aloud. "I will convey your position," he said. "I know you will." She stepped back. "Safe travel, Ambassador." She watched the shuttle doors close, watched it rise, watched it pass through the ceiling hatch and vanish into the sky above. The same sky her grandmother had once watched ships disappear into, only in the opposite direction. She stood in the empty landing bay for a moment. Then she touched the tooth at her throat. Then she went back to work. There was a council meeting in 2 hours. The Defense Committee was presenting updated deployment projections. The Agricultural Board had submitted a request for expanded grow light arrays in Sector 7. 17 administrative systems needed her review before the end of the day. A civilization in the middle of reshaping its future still needed its paperwork done. She walked as the landing bay doors sealed behind her. The city hummed around her. The trains, the fabrication districts, the schools, the parks, the power systems running deep beneath her feet. All of it moving the way it always moved, patient, purposeful, ordinary in the most extraordinary way in the known galaxy. A people who had been told they were finished had answered by building all of this. She did not waste time feeling anything about what had just happened. She saved that for the nights, when the lights in her quarters dimmed to their lowest setting and the hum of the city was the only sound. And she lay awake thinking about her grandmother's hands and the soil of a surface she had never been allowed to touch. Not yet. But soon. The first world went quiet on a Tuesday. That was the detail nobody in the conclave spoke about afterward. That it had happened on an ordinary day in the middle of ordinary things. The Thurin cluster's primary inhabited world, Saith, had been mid-broadcast when the signal cut. Not during a crisis. Not during some grand historical moment that later generations could point to and say, "This is where it began." The final transmission from Saith was a weather report for the northern agricultural territories. Mild winds and a chance of rain. Then nothing. Terran deep-range monitoring stations. The small ones built low, dark, and patient, scattered across the outer system like seeds no one had meant to plant. Caught the silence 11 minutes before the conclave's own network registered the loss. 11 minutes was a long time. Terran analysts used those 11 minutes well. By the time the conclave emergency channels began lighting up, Undercity Akra's intelligence division already had 47 data points on what had happened to Saith. By the time the conclave convened its emergency session, that number had climbed to 212. Commander Yara Oe read the first report at 3:40 in her quarters, in the dark, the way she read everything that arrived during sleep hours. Flat on her back, the screen suspended above her face, the tooth on its cord resting against her collarbone. She read it twice. Then she got up, dressed, and went to the operations center, because sleep was over for the night and likely for several nights after it. The operations center was already full when she arrived. People had come in without being called. That told her everything she needed to know about how the room was reading the situation. When trained professionals report for duty before they are summoned, it means the shape of the problem is already visible to everyone, and the shape is bad. She took her place at the central table. The screens around the room showed the Conclave's emergency feeds beside Terran monitoring data. Saith was gone, not destroyed in any way the sensors could easily interpret. Not bombed, not burned, not cracked apart, simply gone. The planet was still there. The infrastructure was still there. The Void Chorus did not waste energy on rubble. It consumed the complexity of things and left the shells behind. 2 days later, the second world in the Thurin cluster vanished the same way. Then a third. The Conclave's joint military response, 12 warships from 4 member state fleets, assembled in 48 hours, which was genuinely fast by Conclave standards, entered the Thurin system on day 4. They lasted until day 6. Yara watched the engagement feeds with the specific attention of someone who was not watching for outcome, but for mechanics. The Conclave fleet fought the way it always fought. By doctrine, by protocol, by the measured caution of an institution that had not fought a real war in 2 centuries of enforced peace. Calculated engagement. Asset preservation. The tactical withdrawal threshold was set at 30% losses to prevent unacceptable attrition. At 29% losses, the fleet commander ordered retreat. The Void Chorus did not acknowledge the withdrawal. It did not pursue. It simply continued what it had been doing, the way a tide continues doing what a tide does, regardless of whether the things on the shore are running. The fourth world in the Thurin cluster went silent on day 9. In the Terran Council chamber, a room built large enough for exactly this kind of conversation and waiting for it for a very long time, the argument began before the council was formally seated. There were 22 members of the Terran Senior Council. They were not all soldiers. They were not all hawks. There were engineers, doctors, agricultural directors, historians, and 3 people whose primary qualification was that they were extraordinarily good at thinking clearly when everyone around them was not. The argument for letting the Conclave burn was made by 7 of them. Yara let them speak every word. Counselor Addis. Not the general, the historian, an older woman who had spent 60 years documenting what the contact war had cost in generational terms, laid out the case with the cold precision of someone who had spent decades arranging evidence. The Conclave quarantined us. The Conclave left us to die. They filed 17 consecutive survey reports confirming our extinction and did nothing. No aid mission. No follow-up. Not a single vessel sent to determine whether any human being was still breathing. And now they need us. Let me be direct. They need us because they cannot handle this themselves. We can. We have been able to for some time. The question is not capability. The question is whether we owe them anything. And my answer is that we do not. 6 other voices agreed with her. Yara let the agreement settle in the room. Then General Addis. Different woman, same name. A fact that had caused endless administrative confusion and privately amused them both. Stood. The general was 72 years old and built like a question that already knew its answer. She had commanded the Terran Defense Forces for 18 years. She had never fired a weapon in anger because there had been no one to fire at. She had spent 18 years preparing for a moment she privately believed might never come. And she had prepared as though it absolutely would. She said only 7 words. We did not build this to become them. The room went silent. She did not elaborate, did not support it with data, did not add a second sentence. She let the 7 words stand in the silence they created, then sat back down. The debate continued for 4 more hours. It was real. Serious people on both sides. Real arguments. Real weight. Nobody who spoke was foolish. Nobody who spoke was wrong in the small sense. The argument for doing nothing did not come from cowardice or indifference. It came from 200 years of memory, from the knowledge of what abandonment cost, from the entirely human conclusion that a species capable of leaving them once could not be trusted not to do it again. At the end of 4 hours, the vote was taken. 14-8. Not unanimous. 14-8. And the 8 who lost the vote carried their dissent quietly and returned to their duties with full commitment, because that was the kind of people the Terran Continuance Authority had spent 2 centuries selecting, building, and trusting. Yara looked at the result, then at Historian Addis across the table. She nodded once. The historian nodded back. Her face said, "I think you are wrong." Her face also said, "I will not be the reason this fails." That was enough. Yara left the council chamber and walked to her private communications room, a small space off the main corridor, shielded heavily enough that any signal sent from it would not appear on the general monitoring grid. She sat at the single console, pulled up a frequency she had kept stored for 3 weeks, since the day the Conclave diplomatic shuttle had lifted out of the landing bay. She opened the channel. Velarith answered in 40 seconds. He was clearly not sleeping. He likely had not slept since Saith went silent. He looked at her with the face of a man who had been waiting for a call without allowing himself to believe it would come. "Commander Oe," he said. "Ambassador," she replied. "We'll help." The relief that crossed his face was brief and immediately controlled. But she saw it. 300 years of diplomatic discipline, grief, and guilt compressed into a single unguarded half-second. She noted it without comment. "The conclave will be... There are conditions," she said. He stopped, waited. Formal recognition of the contact war as an unprovoked act of aggression against a pre-contact civilization. On the record, unanimous conclave vote. Public. She watched him absorb it. Full Sol system sovereignty. No conclave jurisdiction. No observation rights. No survey access without explicit Terran authorization. She paused. "And one more thing." He waited. She gave him the 3rd condition. He sat back in his chair. She waited while he processed it. Patient. She had been raised by patient people in a city built by patient people beneath a dying world. Patience was not something she practiced. It was something she was. "That will require," he said carefully, "an extraordinary session of the full conclave assembly." "I know. The vote would not be certain." "I know that too." She looked at him. "You have 6 days, Ambassador. The Void Chorus is moving at a rate that places the next inhabited conclave system in its path in 8. I am giving you 6 because I need 2 to move the fleet into position." She said it the way she said everything. Clean. Exact. No decoration. "Use the 6 well." He nodded, then stopped. Something had shifted in his expression. The diplomat was still there, but something older had pushed through beneath it. The younger man from 200 years ago. The one who had sat in the council chamber. The one who had said nothing. The one who had signed his name and moved on. "You said the fleet," he said. "You said you need 2 days to move it into position." He paused. "Where is it now?" "In position for a different deployment scenario." She answered without hesitation. "How many ships?" She had decided in advance that she would tell him. Not because she had to, because she wanted him to understand what had been waiting in the dark beside them all these years. 216 frontline combat vessels, she said. "We have an additional 90 in reserve configuration that can be combat-ready within 72 hours. He was silent for a long moment. "The Conclave's combined active fleet," he said slowly, "before the Duran losses, was 430 vessels across 18 member states." "I know," she said. "You built this." "We built this," she replied. And for the first time in the conversation, something entered her voice that was not pure information. Something with temperature. "Because we were never going to be helpless twice. We were very clear about that. Very, very clear." He absorbed that, then said quietly, "You said you have been watching the Void Chorus for 11 years. "Yes." "How?" She looked at him. She had prepared for this question, had decided in advance exactly how much to give him in this first conversation, before the conditions were signed, before the relationship between what humanity was and what the Conclave thought it was had been formally rewritten. She chose enough to make the point. Not one word more. "We have had monitoring probes in the deep dark for a long time," she said. "Small ones. You did not find them because we built them to be found only if you knew exactly what to look for. And you didn't know what to look for because you built your sensor systems to detect Conclave standard technology." She let this settle. We are not Conclave's standard technology ambassador. We haven't been for a long time. He sat with this. She watched him understand what it meant. That while the Conclave had been conducting 17 consecutive scans of a supposedly dead world and finding nothing, humanity had been running its own monitoring network across a significant portion of explored space quietly, invisibly. For reasons that were now obvious, they had not been hiding from the galaxy. They had been watching it. The Void Chorus, he said, in 11 years of observation. What do you know? More than you, she said. We'll share it when the conditions are agreed. She stood. 6 days, Ambassador, the extraordinary session, then call me. She closed the channel, sat in the small shielded room for a moment. The hum of the city was everywhere, as it always was. The specific low frequency of a place that had been running continuously for 200 years without pausing. Trains, fabricators, water systems, the power grid that fed the grow lights, that fed the crops, that fed the people who had built all of this and kept it running and kept themselves going in the dark because going was the only acceptable option. She thought about what came next, not the battle. She had thought about the battle 10,000 times in drills and simulations and quiet mornings alone with the tactical data. And she was not afraid of the battle. She was afraid of the thing after the battle, which was the part nobody was running simulations on. The part where humanity came out of the ground and the galaxy looked at them and had to decide what they were. She knew what they were. She had always known. She just wasn't sure the galaxy was ready for the answer. The 6th day came. Velarith called at 0600 hours. Yara was already at her desk. She had been at her desk since 0400. There was cold tea beside her, which she had not drunk, which was either habit or a form of tribute to a man she was not going to think about right now. The vote passed, he said. He looked like a man who had not slept in 6 days, which was because he was. All 3 conditions unanimous on the first 2. The third, he paused. 14-4 on the third. It was not easy. I didn't expect it to be. She said, thank you. He looked at her, slight surprise. She did not thank people often, and when she did, it cost her something and he could apparently tell. The fleet, he said. Can you? It's already moving, she said. He blinked. I called you the moment the vote finalized. Yes, she said. I started moving the fleet 2 hours ago. He opened his mouth, closed it. I was confident in the vote, she said. Not arrogant, just accurate. I did not want to lose 2 hours. She pulled up the tactical display on her side of the screen, rotated it so he could see 216 lights moving through the dark information, already through the outer system, already oriented toward the cluster and the thing that was eating worlds there. We enter engagement range in 31 hours. I would recommend the Conclave remaining vessels hold the perimeter and provide communication relay. I mean, no disrespect by that. You mean, he said slowly, that you don't need them? I mean, she said, with the precise care of someone choosing words the way a surgeon chooses tools, that they would be most useful in a support function given the engagement data we've collected. She looked at him directly. The Conclave's fleet doctrine is excellent for what it was built for. This is something different. 10. He nodded. He was past the point of arguing with her about military matters. Commander OAE, he said, is there anything else you need from us? She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it for a few seconds. Because he deserved a genuine answer. No, she said, we have everything we need. We've had it for a while. She looked at him one more time at the 300 years in his face and the guilt that had been sitting in it since the moment he landed in under City Accra and a child of 8 years had asked him a question he couldn't answer. Ambassador, what we're about to do, we're not doing it for you. Be clear on that. He waited. We're doing it because there are people in the Thurin cluster who are going to die if we don't, and they didn't make the decisions their governments made and they don't deserve to pay for it the way we paid for decisions we didn't make. She said it flat, clean, without theater. That's the only reason. Keep that in the file when you write the record of this. He nodded. Something in his face that she didn't look at too long. She closed the channel, stood, walked to the operations room where her fleet commanders were waiting, where the tactical displays were showing the full picture, the Void Chorus moving through the Thurin cluster like a hand wiping a table clean and 216 Terran vessels moving to meet it. And she stood at the center of the room and looked at it all and felt the thing she always felt in these moments. Not fear, not excitement, just the clean, grounded certainty of someone who has been preparing for one specific thing for a very long time and has finally arrived at it. "All right," she said. The room looked at her. "Let's go to work." Belith had attended the funerals of civilizations. He had stood in the formal halls of the conclave assembly and read the names of species that no longer existed, some lost to war, some to disease, some to the slow, grinding eraser of a universe that does not particularly care whether complex life continues. He had read those names in the correct ceremonial register with the correct ceremonial pauses, and he had felt the appropriate weight of each one. He had thought he understood what loss looked like at a civilizational scale. He had not. He was realizing he understood nothing. The observation deck of the Terran flagship Time's Persistence was not a diplomatic space. It had not been built for guests or ceremony, or the comfort of visiting dignitaries. It was a functional room, screens on 3 walls, a central console, the particular cold air of a ship that kept its life support calibrated for function rather than comfort. The view through the forward glass was the Thurin cluster, and what was happening in it. Velarith stood at the glass and watched. Fleet Admiral Asanti had not made him comfortable, had not offered him refreshment or positioned him thoughtfully, or done any of the small hospitality gestures that Velarith had experienced in command spaces across 41 worlds. Asanti was a large man in his mid-50s, dark-skinned with the kind of physical stillness that was not calm, it was control, which was a different thing. He had looked at Velarith when he boarded, nodded once, and returned his attention to his fleet. That was it. That was all the welcome there was. Velarith found to his own surprise that he respected this. The Conclave's 3 remaining Thurin sector vessels were positioned at the engagement perimeter, as OAE had recommended. Communication, relay, and observation. Velarith had chosen to observe from the Time's Persistence rather than the Conclave ships. And this decision had generated significant concern from his security staff, who had accompanied him aboard with the stiff, unhappy posture of people who know they cannot do their job properly in this environment but have no choice but to try. He had told them to stand down. They had not stood down. They had stood in the corner of the observation deck instead, which was the closest thing to standing down that they were capable of. The Void Chorus was visible on the screens. In the 11 years of Terran monitoring data that OAE's people had shared with the Conclave during the 6 days of negotiation, there had been detailed analysis of what the Void Chorus looked like up close. Velarith had read every page. He had thought he was prepared for it. He was not prepared for it. It was not a fleet. It was not creatures exactly. The best analogy the Terran analysts used was whether something that moved with internal logic that was not intelligence as any known species understood intelligence but was also not random. It learned, it adapted, it processed the environment around it and adjusted. What it looked like was a darkness that had decided to have a shape. A movement without clear edges spreading across the scan field like ink in water, except purposeful, directional, hungry, if hunger was a thing you could ascribe to something that had no mouth. It had consumed 4 worlds in the Thurin cluster. The 5th was in its path. The Terran fleet moved to meet it. Velarith had expected something dramatic in that movement. A grand formation, a visual declaration of force. He had seen the Conclave fleet engage the Void Chorus 4 days ago, and the Conclave fleet had made itself large and visible and arranged itself in the defensive arc pattern that was standard doctrine for overwhelming force engagements. The Terran fleet did nothing like that. It split not into 2 groups, but into many 17 distinct elements of varying size, each moving on a different vector, spreading across the engagement space in a pattern that made no visual sense for approximately 4 minutes. And then, when the full shape became apparent on the tactical display, made complete sense in the way that something complicated always looks like chaos until the last piece clicks into place. They were not forming a line. They were forming an enclosure. They're trying to contain it, said the Conclave Admiral standing beside Velarith. Her name was Torv. She was a career military officer of 50 years' experience. And she had the voice of someone who was maintaining professional composure by force of will. You cannot contain the Void Chorus. We established that at the Prime. The Terran fleet is not fighting to preserve its assets. It is fighting to end the engagement. Those are not the same objective. The Void Chorus shifted. It was the first major adaptation it had shown in the engagement, a lateral movement, a spreading of its leading density across the field. A wider front, which was a pattern that Valera had seen in the Thurin Prime battle footage. When the Conclave fleet had done that, the Void Chorus spread and thinned and became impossible to engage concentratedly, and the fleet had been forced to scatter, and the engagement had collapsed into a series of isolated skirmishes that the Chorus won one by one. He watched the Terran fleet response, and his hand, which had been resting on the rail in front of him, tightened without his deciding to tighten it. They had already moved, not in response to the lateral shift before it. 11 separate fleet elements repositioning in the 30 seconds before the Chorus made its move, cutting off the vectors the spread would have needed to be effective, collapsing the engagement space back into a concentrated zone before the Chorus had finished executing its own maneuver. They had anticipated it, Admiral Torvith said slowly. That's not reaction time. They anticipated that. Yes. How? It was not really a question. The answer was obvious to both of them. The Terran fleet had 11 years of Void Chorus movement data. They had watched every engagement, every adaptation, every tactical shift the Chorus had used across 14 consumed worlds. They had cataloged it all and built models and run simulations and prepared responses for every pattern the data showed. They knew this enemy not from the outside, the way the Conclave knew it from crisis reports and emergency responses and the desperate scramble of a military that had been caught unprepared. They knew it from years of quiet, dedicated study while nobody was watching, from inside a sealed planet. From the dark, Admiral Asante's voice came across the open channel. He was directing fleet elements across several simultaneous threads of communication with the calm of a man watering a garden, purposeful, measured, each movement placed. He had not looked at the observation deck once since the engagement began. A query came through from the Conclave's communication relay vessel, asking about the repositioning, the anticipation, how the fleet had known to move before the Void Chorus committed to its lateral shift. Asante reached over to the open channel without turning from his tactical display. He answered the query in the same tone he used for everything. Not unkind, not arrogant, simply factual. That's Pattern 7 from the Conclave's Contact War Playbook, Revised Edition. We've been running simulations against it since I was 12. The relay channel was quiet for a long moment. Torvith made a sound beside him. Not a word, just a sound. The sound of a thing settling that had been incorrectly balanced. The Conclave's Contact War Playbook, the tactical doctrine humanity had studied from the wreckage of what had been done to them. Taken apart, understood at a fundamental level, drilled into children in the schools of Undercity Acre. Not because the Conclave was the enemy anymore, but because understanding the Conclave's doctrine was the first step to building something that went past it. And the Void Chorus had learned its movement patterns from the 14 civilizations it had consumed, most of them Conclave members, all of them fighting with Conclave-adjacent doctrine. So when the Void Chorus used a Conclave pattern lateral shift, the Terran fleet saw a Conclave lateral shift and responded before it fully formed. 47 years of simulations running against patterns that the Void Chorus itself had absorbed from previous engagements and now used as its own. Pattern recognition going 4 levels deep. 200 years of fury turned into 47 years of homework. Valera thought about the child in the landing bay. Are you here to apologize? He thought about the schools with their flower boxes 400 meters underground. He thought about Commander Oae at 17 deciding what her grandmother's tooth meant, deciding what it was for. He thought about all the things that got built in the dark when someone left you there long enough. The engagement broke at hour 19. Not because the Void Chorus was destroyed, it was not. It was not the kind of thing that destroyed cleanly. But at hour 19, something changed in its movement. A hesitation, a pulling back of density from the leading edge. A behavioral shift that the Terran fleet analysts could hear in the background of the command channel voices, fast and precise, identified in real time as a recalibration response. The Void Chorus was processing the engagement. It had run its known patterns, all of them, one after another across 19 hours, and every one had been anticipated. Every adaptation had been met. It had consumed civilizations by being a thing that learned faster than anything it encountered. It had not encountered anything like this before. Pulled back. Not a rout, not a defeat, a withdrawal into deep space, a regrouping, a behavior that the Terran analysts were already categorizing and debating in real time. Velareth listened to them debate it with the speed and precision of people who had been thinking about this exact question for years and were now working with real data instead of models. The fifth world in the Thurin cluster was still there, not saved exactly. The Void Chorus had not finished with it. But it was still there, which was more than the previous four could claim. The Terran fleet held its position and did not pursue. Fleet Admiral Asante ordered a full damage assessment and recovery operation with the same businesslike calm he had used for everything else, and the fleet began the organized work of accounting for itself. Velareth did the accounting too in his own way. Terran losses, 31 vessels. Not destroyed, some of them the ones that had taken catastrophic hits. The others were damaged at various levels of severity. Crews alive, ships recoverable. 31 out of 216. 14%. In any conclave engagement doctrine, 14% was an acceptable loss rate for an engagement of this scale and intensity. He stood at the glass and looked at the recovery operation beginning in the space ahead of him. Ships moving to assist damaged vessels, emergency teams deploying, the organized and practiced efficiency of a force that had prepared for this too. And he did not feel anything as clean as relief. What he felt was harder to name. He thought about the conclave emergency session 6 days ago, the 14-4 vote. For people who had looked at humanity's 3 conditions and found one of them too much to give. He had argued for 6 hours in that session. He had not been eloquent. He had simply been, for the first time in his career, unable to be anything except honest. He had told the assembly what he had seen underground, the parks, the schools, the child with her question. He had told them as plainly as he knew how that what was sitting in the Sol system was not what the quarantine file described. And that when humanity came out of the ground and they would come out, the only question was what shape the coming out took. The conclave had one opportunity to be on the right side of that moment. 14-4. He was grateful for the 14. He was not surprised by the 4. He had been on councils long enough to understand that some people were constitutionally incapable of seeing the shape of a moment until after it had passed. Admiral Torvith was standing beside him still. She had been quiet for a long time. She looked at the screens the way people look at things that have changed the internal architecture of something they thought was settled. They held, she said finally. Yes, he said. 14% losses. 19 hours. They held. Yes. She was quiet again. Then our fleet at the prime 30% losses and we withdrew. The doctrine. She paused. The doctrine is built for an enemy that stops. She looked at him. The Void Chorus does not stop. He said. Humanity understood that before they ever engaged it. They built a doctrine for an enemy that does not stop, which required them to also become something that does not stop. He looked at the screens, the 31 damaged and destroyed ships, the fourth world still sitting in the Thurin system. The cost of becoming that is what you saw in those 19 hours. She had nothing to say to this. He didn't need her to. He stayed on the observation deck for a long time after that, watching the recovery operation until the cluster star moved past the edge of the forward glass and the screens showed only the dark and the fleet working quietly in it. Then he went to write his report. He wrote it carefully. He wrote it in the specific way he had learned in 300 years of service, the only way that reports of this nature served any purpose, not as confirmation of what the conclave already believed, but as an honest account of what had actually happened. He wrote about the 19 hours. He wrote about Pattern 7. He wrote about the destroyer that had accelerated instead of withdrawing, and what that meant about the people who had crewed it and the civilization that had raised them. He wrote about the 14% and what 14% looked like from the observation deck of the ship that was carrying it. He wrote one final line that he had not planned when he sat down. They did not fight like they had something to prove. They fought like they had something to finish. He sent the report. Then he sat in the small diplomatic cabin they had given him, and he thought about a child of 8 with a question he still had not answered. He thought about it for a long time outside in the dark. The Terran fleet held the line around a world that was still there. The Conclave's Grand Assembly Hall was the kind of room designed to make individuals feel small. Yara had read about it. Photographs and architectural schematics had been in the Terran intelligence files for decades, sourced from intercepted Conclave communications, from study of public broadcasts, from the particular obsessive thoroughness of people who had spent 200 years making sure they knew everything about the organization that had left them to die. The hall seated 4,000. The ceiling was 60 meters above the floor. The central speaking platform was elevated and ringed with light that hit the speaker from above, making them visible to everyone and making them look subtly like they were being judged by something larger than themselves. Standing in it was different from reading about it. It was a very large room. She gave it that. She had arrived without an escort fleet. 1 shuttle, 3 aides, and her own 2 feet walking across the landing platform in the kind of clothes that made a statement by not making one dark, plain, practical, the same things she wore on working days in Undercity Acre. No ceremonial dress, no medals, though she had several. No tear seal on her collar, though one had been offered. The tooth on its cord at her throat under the fabric. That was all. The Conclave Protocol Office had sent 3 separate messages in the week before this session, each one politely requesting information about the Terran delegation size and ceremonial requirements. She had replied to all 3 with the same answer. 1 person, no requirements. The Protocol Office had not known what to do with this and had eventually done nothing, which was fine. The session had been called as a formal recognition ceremony. That was what the agenda said. The language in the official documentation used phrases like historic reconciliation, renewed partnership, and the beginning of a new chapter in galactic relations, all of which were technically accurate in the way that describing a tidal wave as significant water movement was technically accurate. The hall was full. Every member state delegation present, every seat taken, the press enclosures packed, the observation galleries above holding what looked like every diplomat, analyst, and political figure in range who had been able to arrange credentials in the 3 weeks since the Duran engagement. For 1,000 people who had all, in one way or another, spent the last month rearranging their understanding of what the galaxy contained. They watched her walk across the floor to the central platform. She was aware of being watched in the way a person is aware of weather, not self-consciously, just as a fact of the environment. She did not perform for it, did not slow down or speed up or look around at the galleries. She walked at the pace she always walked, which was the pace of someone going somewhere specific for a reason. The conclave's presiding speaker met her at the platform steps. His name was Archon Suvin, and he was the most senior active official in the conclave's governance structure, a distinction he had held for 30 years, and wore the way very old furniture wears polish, smoothly and completely so that you almost couldn't see the wood underneath anymore. He was gracious. He was warm. He extended the formal greeting gesture of the host civilization, and she returned it correctly because she had learned it at age 6 in a school 400 meters underground. He led her to the platform. The address began. It was a good speech. She would give it that. Solivuan had spent 30 years at the top of conclave governance, and he had not gotten there by being a poor communicator. The speech was structured beautifully. It moved from acknowledgement to context to resolution in a clean arc, and the language was careful and warm and hit the emotional registers it was aiming for with the accuracy of long practice. She counted 11 uses of the passive voice in 4 minutes. Regrettable circumstances arose. Not we made decisions. Circumstances arose as though on their own, from the floor, without human agency attached to them. Contact protocols were misapplied. Not we weaponized first contact with a pre-spaceflight civilization. Protocols were misapplied the way a tool is misapplied, as though the hand holding the tool was not there. Outcomes were not intended. Not we quarantined a species we had bombed and left them to die in the dark for 200 years, and checked on them 17 times, and every time confirmed they were dead and moved on. Outcomes were not intended, floating free of cause and consequence, and the specific people who had sat in specific rooms and made specific choices. She sat through it completely still, her hands in her lap, the expression of someone listening to weather. The speech turned in its final section to the future, to what the conclave was prepared to offer, to the remarkable partnership that lay ahead. Full membership in the Galactic Conclave with all rights and responsibilities thereto. A permanent seat on the Security Council. Reparations substantial and immediate toward the restoration of Earth's surface. Co-development agreements for technology exchange. A joint commission to oversee the dismantling of the Sol quarantine infrastructure. It was by any measure a significant offer, the kind of offer that would have been extraordinary at any point in the last 2 centuries. The kind of offer that, if she had been her grandmother, would have seemed like the answer to a prayer. She was not her grandmother. Her grandmother had survived 11 years on a dying surface, teaching children things they would need. Her grandmother had given her daughter a tooth from her own mouth and said, "Give this to your daughter. Let her decide what it means." Yara had decided at 17. Suvlin finished. The hall was very quiet, the silence of 4,000 people all holding the same breath. She stood. She did not approach the speaking position immediately. She stood at her seat for a moment, looking at the room, looking at the delegations, the galleries, the 60-meter ceiling with its particular light. She had grown up under lower ceilings than this one. She had grown up in rooms that were excellent at what they did and had never once been designed to make anyone feel small. She walked to the speaking position. She looked at the room. She had prepared remarks, 12 pages written over 3 weeks, reviewed by the council, precise and comprehensive and correct in every particular. They addressed the membership offer, the reparation structure, the technology co-development framework, the quarantine dismantling timeline. They were good remarks. They said everything that needed to be said clearly and completely. She did not use them. She looked at the hall, at 4,000 people who had come here expecting a ceremony and were going to get something different. She said, "We don't want a seat at your table. We built one." The silence was total. She reached into her jacket and produced a data chip, small, flat, the standard Terran format that the conclave systems could read without an adapter, because of course they could, because Terran engineers had made sure of that a long time ago. She set it on the surface of the speaking platform. "That's our terms," she said. "You have 30 days. She stepped back from the speaking position. She walked across the platform and down the steps and across the floor of the hall in the same silence that she had walked into it with. And 4,000 people watched her go, and nobody said anything until she was through the main doors and the doors had closed behind her. Then the hall erupted in exactly the noise she had expected it to erupt in, which was why she had already left. Her aide, Kofi, was waiting in the corridor with her jacket and a look of intense personal satisfaction that he was not quite hiding. "Well," he said. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something." He handed her the jacket. "The shuttle is ready." She put the jacket on, touched the tooth through the fabric, and started walking. Behind the closed doors, the hall was still going. She could hear it, the specific sound of a very large room full of very important people all trying to talk at once. It would take them a while to sort out what had just happened, and what to do about it, and whether the chip's contents were acceptable, and what the leverage was, and where the negotiating room existed. They had 30 days. They would use 28 of them arguing and 2 of them agreeing, because that was how institutions worked. And she had accounted for this, and the terms on the chip were exactly what she had said they were in the communications room 3 weeks ago. The 2 non-negotiable things and the rest which was negotiable. She had been precise about which was which. She always was. The shuttle lifted 6 minutes later. She sat in the forward seat and looked down through the port at the conclave's capital world shrinking below her. Glass in height and 2,000 years of institutional architecture. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Tired. Not physically, the other kind. The kind that is not really tiredness, but the particular feeling of a weight you have carried so long that its absence feels strange. It was not gone. She knew that. The work was not done. It would not be done in her lifetime, possibly. There were things on the chip that would take decades to implement and generations to measure. The Void Chorus was still out there, recalibrating, which meant the TCA's fleet was going to be doing this again. And the galaxy needed to figure out what that relationship looked like in the long term. The surface of Earth needed 10 years of remediation before it could sustain agricultural use, and another 20 before the first permanent surface structures were safe to inhabit. There was a very large amount of work still to do. She looked out the port at the stars. She thought about her grandmother, which she did not normally allow herself to do during working hours. She thought about 11 years on a dying surface, about teeth on cords. About what it meant that the girl who had been handed that tooth was now sitting in a shuttle, leaving the Conclave's capital world after setting a data chip on their speaking platform and telling 4,000 of the most powerful people in the galaxy that they had 30 days. What it meant was very simple. It meant the tooth had been for something all along. She fell asleep in the shuttle, which she had not done in 3 weeks of working days and nights, and she slept without dreams. And Kofi covered her with his own jacket and did not wake her for 7 hours. When she woke up, they were almost home. 6 months later, on a morning in what would have been late spring if the surface had been habitable, the first reclamation teams went up, not military. The military had done its part. These were engineers and agricultural specialists and soil scientists and remediation crews with equipment that had been designed specifically for this, designed underground over many years by people who had always intended to use it exactly here, exactly for this. The reclamation started in what had been the Accra metropolitan region. It was not arbitrary. The largest of the underground cities was directly below. The people who had built it underground had built it below the place they came from. And when it was time to go back, they went back to the same ground. The radiation scrubbing drones went first. They swept in low passes across the surface for 4 days, methodical, overlapping their coverage the way you scrub a floor. Not once, but twice, not twice, but 3 times, until the instrument said the numbers had moved enough to permit the next stage. Then the soil teams, then the planting crews who brought seeds that had been preserved underground for 2 centuries. Not in storage, not in cold vault stasis, but actively maintained, grown in rotation. Each generation of seeds descended from seeds that had been carried underground in the first year and kept going ever since. 200-year-old seed lines, every harvest replanted, nothing lost. Yara stood on a ridge above the Accra Basin on the 4th day of planting operations and looked at it for the first time. She had seen photographs. She had seen the geological surveys and the remediation progress reports and the drone footage from every angle. She had processed the data of this place for years, its radiation index, its soil composition, its topography, its historical records. She had known it in the way that you can know a place entirely without knowing it. This was different. The sky was bigger than she had expected. That was the thing nobody had told her, and she had not been able to prepare for. That the sky was not a ceiling, but an absence, a space that did not end. Blue-gray, with high cloud in the particular pale quality of a world still healing. And it went up and did not stop. She had lived her whole life under ceilings, good ones. Ceilings she had never resented because they were necessary, and because what was under them was worth protecting. But they were ceilings. This was not a ceiling. She stood in the wind, actual wind, which moved against her face with the careless abundance of something that had no idea it was extraordinary, and looked at the teams below her in the basin, working in organized lines through the freshly turned soil. Thousands of people. The first humans to work surface soil in 200 years, doing it with the calm efficiency of people who had been preparing for this specific task long enough that it felt like coming home rather than arriving somewhere new. Because it was. A group of children moved through the perimeter near the base of the ridge. A school group. She could see the teachers at the edges, keeping the loose boundaries that kept children somewhere in the vicinity of where they were supposed to be without crushing the essential disorder of a pack of young people experiencing something for the first time. The children were in the soil up to their elbows within 3 minutes of arrival, which was predictable and correct, and exactly what soil was for. One girl, maybe 8 or 9, was crouched at the edge of a freshly turned bed with her hands pressed flat to the ground. Not digging, not planting. Just pressing her hands down into the dark earth with the focused stillness of someone paying very close attention to something important. She lifted her hands and looked at them, looked at the earth on her palms, turned them over, looked at the sky. Yara watched this from the ridge and felt the things she felt come up in her chest and move through her throat and sit behind her eyes. And she let it because there was no one watching her from up here, and because some things deserved to be felt completely when they arrived. She had spent her whole life carrying things toward this, the tooth, her grandmother's hands, the 11 years on the surface, and the thing that was built from them underground, and the 200 years of patience that were not really patience but purpose, slow-burning generation to generation. Passed down in schools and dinner tables, in the specific way people in under-city Accra touched each other's shoulders when they passed in corridors. A thing her grandmother had apparently done too, which Yara had not known was a habit she had inherited until someone pointed it out when she was 30. 200 years of things carried forward. Coming finally to this, a girl's hands in the first clean soil. She reached up and held the tooth through her jacket, held it for a moment, felt its specific shape, the one she had memorized so long ago she could not remember memorizing it. Then she let it go. She looked at the basin below, at the teams working in their organized lines through the dark earth, at the sky that did not end, at the children in the soil, at the ridge under her feet, which was the surface of a planet that had been declared dead and had declined to comply. The conclave had 30 days on the chip's terms, and they were going to use 28 of them arguing, and then the work of building whatever came next would begin, which was going to be complicated and long and full of the specific friction of new things finding their shape. There were 4,000 things to negotiate and 17 categories of disagreement. And the Void Chorus was still somewhere in the dark, doing the slow math of its recalibration, and her fleet needed resupply, and the remediation schedule had already hit its first delay in Sector 3, and the Council had requested a briefing on the technology exchange framework that she needed to prepare by end of next week. There was a very large amount of work still to do. She stood in the wind on the ridge above the Acre Basin and looked at the girl in the soil and the sky that didn't stop. And she breathed in the particular smell of the surface mineral, cold-edged, the distant green of things beginning, and she took exactly as long as she needed. Then she turned back down the ridge toward the base camp. Back to work. The ground did not shake under her feet. It never needed to. The trembling had always been in the ones who looked at this world from the safety of deep space and decided they knew what it was. The ones who had assumed that silence was the same as death. That 200 years underground was the same as gone. That a people written off stayed written off. The ground was solid under her feet. Had always been solid. For 100 meters below it, a city hummed. 6 months from now, the first surface structure would break ground above that city, and the sky and the underground would connect, and the long separation of those two things would be over. The girl in the soil was still looking at her hands, still looking at the sky. Yara walked down the ridge and got back to work. And above her, for the first time in 200 years, the sky of Earth was full of nothing threatening at all. Just light, just wind, just a world deciding quietly and finally what came next.